If you're going to be betting on the UFC this weekend, you need to stick around because I've got 15 years of experience making money betting on this sport. And in today's video, I'm going to be sharing my fight research with you that has taken me hours and hours and hours and hours to get through. We're going to be analysing these fights in a lot of depth from a betting perspective so that you can see the strengths and weaknesses of both fighters, how they match up, and what this means from a betting perspective. As ever, we're going to be showing a lot of footage from both fighters in the key matchups so that you can see with your own eyes which fighters are more likely to win. I hope that by the end of this video, if you have got some bets for this weekend's card, you'll be either feeling more confident in what you've bet, or maybe we've given you some other things to think about which could help you avoid taking a loss. But either way, I'm confident by the time we get through this video, you'll be much better prepared for betting this weekend's card than you are right now going in. If you like watching the UFC live and you spend most weekends watching UFC events live, I'd highly recommend checking out my live betting group. I am the best in the world when it comes to live betting on the UFC. It is my speciality. I've been making money doing this for 15 years. It is my bread and butter. We make a profit on approximately 70% of UFC events over the long term. And if you're in my live betting group, you're absolutely going to love it. You need to give it a try. We've got a big summer coming up, loads of UFC events. So why not earn a bit of cash while you watch the sport you love? And you know what's better? Obviously, cards like this aren't the most exciting. Ariel Helwani talking about MMA being in a recession. But you know what does make it exciting? Live betting the fights and being profitable at the same time. Making money watching the fights, making money live betting the fights can take your enjoyment of this sport to another level. So check out the link in the description below. And now let's dive into talking about the main event, which is going to be Erin Blanchfield versus Maycee Barber. Classic striker versus grappler matchup. And we can see the betting market at the moment is favouring Erin Blanchfield, with her odds consistently declining since they opened. She's now down to around a 1.42 favourite on average, which is going to be minus 238 for an implied probability of 70%. And with the way the odds are moving on this fight, it looks like Blanchfield's odds are going to continue to get worse. Barber's odds are around about 2.90, which is going to be plus 190 for an implied probability of 34%. So Blanchfield is 26 years old, 5'4" with a 68-inch reach, and Maycee Barber is 27 years old, 5'5" with a 65-inch reach. So we can see both girls are about the same size, and we can see that there's not much of a difference in age either. So very interesting matchup this. If you're familiar with both of these fighters, which almost everyone watching this video will be, you will know Blanchfield is the grappler and Barber is the striker. You will also know that if the fight goes to the ground, Blanchfield will have a big advantage, and if the fight stays standing, Barber will have a big advantage when it comes to striking. So what we really need to focus on when we analyse this fight from a betting point of view is trying to determine whether or not Blanchfield has the skills to get this fight to the ground and keep the fight on the ground, because we know she can dictate where the fight takes place and keep the fight on the ground. Barber's going to struggle pretty badly. So we want to put a lot of emphasis in this breakdown on how these two girls match up when it comes to grappling, and shortly I'll be showing you some video footage of both girls so you can see for yourselves how they match up when it comes to grappling. But in terms of striking, one thing these two do have in common, they're very different styles of strikers, but when you watch a bit of footage on both of these two, one thing that you will notice straight away is how bad their striking defense is. Even Maycee Barber, who does have the edge on the feet here, if you look at her fight against Andrea Lee, she took so much damage, and this is because she's just one of those fighters that doesn't mind eating a shot to give a shot. So she doesn't mind standing right in front of her opponent and just playing rock'em sock'em robot. She's tough as nails. We've seen her take tons of damage in fights, and it doesn't slow her down. If anything, it seems to motivate her and light a fire under her sometimes when she takes a lot of damage in fights. Whereas with Blanchfield, she's also very tough, but she's not as dangerous offensively as Barber. So with both these girls being tough as nails and bad defensively, if these two do start to exchange on the feet, that gives Barber a huge edge, simply because she's mean, she's nasty, she's aggressive, and she hits hard. And Blanchfield doesn't really have the power to hurt Barber. So if Blanchfield's going to land clean and hard on Barber and make Barber pay for her bad defense, it's not really going to cause Barber too much of a problem. But if Barber lands clean and hard on Blanchfield, she's going to do significant amounts of damage. So generally, that's all you really need to know about how these two match up on the feet. And Barber has a big advantage there. Now, when we're breaking down UFC fights and analysing these matchups from a betting perspective, we've always got to consider what is most likely to happen based on their past performances, and also acknowledge that we don't have a crystal ball and we can't see into the future, as much as many people in this space talk like they can. We don't have a crystal ball, and quite often when we're betting on UFC fights, we see one or both fighters perform very differently from how they have in recent matchups. A very good example of this in recent history was the fight between Jack Della Maddalena and Belal Muhammad, where any logical person betting that fight would have watched how bad Maddalena's takedown offense and ground game looked in past fights against, guys like Basel Hafez and Gilbert Burns, and come to the conclusion that with Belal Muhammad being such a good MMA grappler, it was going to be a very easy fight for Belal Muhammad. And the betting market reflected that, right? With Belal Muhammad being a pretty big favourite going into that fight. But if you go back and watch our breakdown for that matchup, we spoke about there being potential signs in Maddalena's performance against both Hafez and Burns, which suggested that if he just made a few adjustments, he could potentially give Belal Muhammad big problems and be very difficult to take down and hold down. And of course, that's what we saw in the fight. Maddalena was able to win. So whilst we don't have a crystal ball and we can't see into the future, there are sometimes, not always and not very often, but sometimes clues in past performances to enable us to project potential improvements that one fighter may demonstrate. And so what I can tell you about the matchup this weekend between Blanchfield and Barber is that it's kind of similar to the matchup between, Muhammad and Maddalena, in the sense that based on past performances, this should be a very easy fight for Erin Blanchfield, because Macy Barber's takedown offense in the past has looked very bad, and she's also very weak off her back. So with Blanchfield being such a good offensive wrestler, she should be able to get Barber down easily and control her. That's based on past performances, and that is why the betting market is pricing Blanchfield at such a big favourite at an implied probability of around 70%, because based on past performances, that is the probability that Blanchfield has of winning this. So if you do want to bet the fight this weekend, you've got to basically have one of two perspectives. You've got to have the perspective that both these girls are going to show up and perform like they usually do, and if that's the case, you would take Blanchfield. But if you're open-minded to the possibility that Barber could have improved her takedown offense and ground game, then you would consider betting Barber. So now let's explore the idea that Barber may have improved her takedown defense at a level which could give Blanchfield some problems. And what we'll also do is take a little bit of a look at the footage to see if there's any clues there that Barber may actually make that level of improvement she needs in order to give Blanchfield some trouble this weekend. If we take a look at Barber's MMA record, we can start to paint a picture of probability around how much improvement we may have seen in Barber's takedown offense and ground game in recent years. And she has been quite inactive for a young fighter, so we can see she's been out for about a year, just over a year, and then there's a decent amount of time between these two fights as well. And obviously, when we're analysing this fight, we're trying to answer the question of how likely it is that Blanchfield is going to be able to use a grappling heavy game plan to take Barber down and control her for the vast majority of this fight. The problem we've got with the way Barber's recent career history has gone is we haven't really seen her takedown defense and ground game tested for 2 years. The last time we really saw it tested was in March 2023 against Andrea Lee, because even though Amanda Ribas is a good MMA grappler, she made a lot of mistakes in this fight didn't grapple as much as she should, and wasn't particularly effective with her grappling in that fight due to bad fight IQ, poor decision making. Then in her most recent fight, just over a year ago, we know that Caitlin Kerminara is predominantly a striker. She's nowhere near the level of offensive wrestler that Blanchfield is. And so even though Barber was able to keep that fight standing, it doesn't tell us a lot because Kamara didn't really try that hard to take her down. And she's nowhere near the level of Blanchfield, even if she tried to take her down. So this is where it does become dangerous, in my opinion, to bet Blanchfield as such a big favourite this weekend, because Barber is only 27 years old, which means she is at that stage in her career where she should be rapidly improving from fight to fight. And we are seeing improvement in her. We're not seeing massive improvement in her from fight to fight, but then we haven't really seen her takedown defense and ground game in the last 2 years to know where it's at. And I will say the same about Blanchfield that I said about Belal Muhammad. And look, I think Belal's striking looked pretty good against Jack Della Maddalena, a lot better than I expected. I know he got outstruck, I know he took a lot of damage, but Belal's striking looked the best it's ever looked. This is another one of those fights where I am getting vibes with Blanchfield like I got with Belal, where the problem you have with these fighters like Erin Blanchfield and Belal Muhammad, and in the context of how the Maddalena Muhammad fight played out, this may not make a lot of sense to you if you're thinking about the sport in a linear fashion. You just need to open your mind up now, right? And consider how limited Belal Muhammad's striking was going into the Maddalena fight. And in these videos, in this analysis, every week we talk about how fighters often show up and perform way better or way worse than they have in the past. Maddalena's takedown offense looked way better than it had in the past, but Belal Muhammad's striking also looked way better than it had in the past. But going into that fight, it was reasonable for us to say, based on past performances, Belal Muhammad doesn't really have the striking to set his takedowns up, because he doesn't really have too much power in his hands, and Maddalena's just on that other level when it comes to striking. That wasn't the case in the fight, but it was going in based on everything that we knew. We don't have a crystal ball. Always important to remember that. And Blanchfield has the same problem going into this fight. It doesn't mean that on Saturday night Blanchfield striking can't look amazing. It can, because just like Barber at 27 years old can be improving her takedown offense and ground game at a rapid rate, Blanchfield can be improving her striking at a rapid rate too. But again, based on past performances, Blanchfield's striking is very limited. Doesn't have much power in her hands, doesn't move particularly well, is bad defensively, and ultimately doesn't have the striking to set her takedowns up. And this is why she has struggled very badly against Manon Fiorot. And for a big chunk of the fight against Rose, she struggled against Rose too. To be fair, she struggled against Taylor Santos as well, and early against Jessica Andrade. The thing with Blanchfield is she isn't the most physically imposing fighter. So the reason why she doesn't have too much power in her hands is the same reason why she doesn't have much physicality on the ground. Her cardio is amazing, but she has to give up the same trade-off that a guy like Merab Dvalishvili has, in that they just lack the physicality. And we talk about this trade-off all the time. We'll be talking about it in the breakdown for next week's fight between Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili, where generally speaking you get one of two strengths. You either get a fighter with amazing cardio that lacks physicality, or a fighter with amazing physicality that lacks cardio. You can't have both very often. If you do have both, you end up with a unicorn and a generational talent like a Kamaru Usman, but it doesn't come along very often. So Blanchfield's in that category of fighter that has amazing cardio and can push a very high pace, but she lacks physicality. Whereas Barber is a bit of a unicorn because she's very physically imposing, hits very hard, but she's also got incredible cardio. So this fight becomes an interesting one, because if Barber's improved her takedown offense and ground game just a little bit, she'll likely be too physically imposing. for Blanchfield to be able to take her down. And with Blanchfield not having particularly good striking to be able to set her takedowns up, could make it very difficult for Blanchfield to get this fight to the ground and keep the fight on the ground if Barber's just improved her takedown defense by a little bit. So what we're going to do now is show you footage from both of these girls so that you can make a judgment call for yourself on whether you want to bet this fight and who you want to go with. So what we first need to do is set our stall out and show you what you're working with when it comes to Maycee Barber, because we've been talking a lot about how her takedown offense and ground game isn't good, but we haven't actually shown you any evidence of that. So we will kick things off with the Amanda Ribas versus Barber fight. And again, we're just going to skim through the striking exchanges because we can all accept that Barber will have a big advantage when it comes to striking. So we can start to look at the grappling positions here. So 2 minutes in, Ribas shoots the first takedown, right? In on it, kind of a nothing really, just kind of drives her into the cage. And you can see that Barber does a good job of going to wrist control and creating a wide base against the cage. But in this position, there are a lot of issues with Barber, right? So Ribas is struggling to get the takedown, but both girls are making mistakes here. Barber is making the mistake of going to wrist control and fucking about trying to put forearms in Ribas's face and stuff like that. What Barber should be focusing on here is getting those underhooks in play, and she doesn't, which leaves her susceptible to the takedown. Here, though, Ribas isn't thinking fast enough to get in deep on the legs of Barber, because why do we go to underhooks, right? We go to underhooks, think about the word, a hook. A hook makes it difficult for someone like Ribas in this position to get past the hook and get in deep enough on the legs to get the takedown. But Ribas isn't taking the invitation. So even though Barber has no underhooks here and her lower body is fully exposed, Ribas isn't using the correct technique to get her down. Ribas is above hip height. Ribas should be in on the legs here. So big mistake that Ribas makes. Very big. Very, very, very big. And now you see Maycee's got the underhook here, which means it's too late now for Ribas to drop down. So this is a fight where Barber's takedown offense does hold up better than in past fights. But a big part of the reason why it holds up better than in past fights is because Ribas just makes so many mistakes. So if we continue to skip through, you can see that eventually Barber does give up a cheap takedown, which she really shouldn't. Like, if I can manage to pause this at the correct moment, like, look at this. Like, Ribas has nothing here. Like, she barely has control of the head. I hope you can just about see that. You can't really because my fucking face cam is in the way. But just take it from me, Ribas barely has any control of Barber's head or body there. So this is where you'll start to see some improvement in Barber. So pay attention to this, and then when I show you footage of the Andrea Lee fight, you will see improvement there. So when we are talking about takedown defense, we want to see a fighter demonstrate a lot of urgency when they get to the ground, right? I always say it's not a huge issue if a fighter has bad takedown defense, as long as they can quickly work their way back up to their feet. And here Barber does a really good job of quickly scooting her butt over to the cage, getting her back square to the cage, clearing her legs out from underneath Ribas and standing back up. That's a game changer. And that is something that Barber has badly struggled with prior to this fight. And of course, if we look at the timeline of her career, we can see that Barber fought Ribas about 3 months after she fought Andrea Lee. So you will see shortly, that's big. Like, the fact Barber's been able to get taken down and then pop back up to her feet that quickly, and then use the correct technique here to work hard to break the body lock and then turn into Ribas. That's all good stuff. That's really good. And that's basic things that Barber wasn't doing against Andrea Lee, which we'll show you shortly. So then you can see Rebus looks for another one of those judo throws, but this time Barber's learnt from it and doesn't fall for it. And so you get Rebus just rolling for a leg for most of the rest of the round. And Barber does a good job of staying heavy and tight from top position to flow on top position. So you can see here, obviously we're not focusing on the striking here because it'll just make this breakdown video super long. But we're only about 6 minutes into the fight. And when we hit play, you'll see loads of damage on Barber's face, right? And you can see this is just because she wants to engage you. She wants to stand right in front of you and throw down. And again, here you're seeing, and you'll see it in the Andrea Lee fight, she doesn't mind taking a shot to give a shot, but she's a tough fucker. She hits a lot harder than Blanchfield. And so I just want to show you that because earlier in the fight I referenced how bad Barber's defense was, and you see it here, and you'll see it in the Andrea Lee fight as well with how much damage she takes in that fight. So again, she gives up a weak-ass judo throw there, which she really should not be giving up at this level. But she does get taken down. And now remember in the first round of this fight, she got taken down with a judo throw, and she quickly scooted her butt over to the cage and wall walked back up to her feet immediately. So here she's been taken down when she's not facing the cage, or her back isn't facing the cage, so it's harder for her to do that. She'd have to rotate her body to go like this way or go all the way across the other side of the octagon to wall work on the other side. So instead she's going to have to get creative, and she starts to try and use butterfly hooks in her knees and her legs to create space for herself off her back to pop back up to her feet. And you can see Rebus is doing a good job of staying heavy and tight from top position to maintain that top position. But what all that scrambling off Macy's back does is enables her to rotate her body. So you can see in this position here, with 3 minutes left to go in the round, Macy's feet are pointing towards the cage. But with all that scrambling off her back, she very cleverly and slowly rotates her body so that her back is now square to the cage. If we skip through, we can see just 10 seconds later, now she's in a position to scoot her butt over to the cage and start a wall walk. And you can see here, that's what she starts to do. Very subtle movements, back over to the cage. And then, just like in round one, need to clear this left leg from underneath Rebus. She's obviously a little tired right now, but any second now, just skip forward a bit. There, she makes her move and she gets back up. And then, out in the middle of the octagon, she gets the stoppage. After both girls just start playing Rock'em Sock'em Robots. And you can see how much damage Macy's got on her face there, but you can also see how aggressive she is. Look, at the end of the day, if Blanchfield and Barber start to exchange and throw down and play Rock'em Sock'em Robots, there's only going to be one winner, and her name's Macy Barber, trust me. And then Barber gets the stoppage, saw gravy, baby, all sorted. So, we talk about fighters being on a continuous journey of self-improvement. You have to be, right? Every one of us should be. I work hard all the time to improve everything that I do. I'm guessing you do as well. We're always getting better, and we shouldn't be surprised that UFC fighters are the same. So it shouldn't be a shock to any of us when fighters do make big improvements from fight to fight. And what's interesting about Macy Barber is that she's potentially improving at a rapid rate. So we can see the timeline of her recent career is the Kermanara fight, which involved very little grappling, so it's not that valuable for us to watch that. And then we've got the Amanda Rebus fight, which we've just skimmed through. And then immediately before that, we've got the Andrea Lee fight. And so what's very interesting about what I'm about to show you is that there's only 3 months between these two fights. And obviously the Andrea Lee fight took place before the Amanda Rebus fight. And just look at how much worse Barber's takedown defense and ground game is in this fight. Because what we're trying to measure is the rate of improvement, right? One of the reasons why we were able to start to lean more towards Jack Della Maddalena in that recent fight against Belal Muhammad is we looked at the difference in Maddalena's performances between the Bahazil Hafez fight and the Gilbert Burns fight, and we were able to see massive improvement in a short space of time. And then we were able to extrapolate that over the amount of time there's been since Madalena fought Gilbert Burns, and we're able to say, look, if Madalena, you know, improves by that percentage amount from the Burns fight going into the Muhammad fight that he did between the Hafez and Burns fight, very likely he gives Belal Muhammad a lot of trouble here. And we're trying to do the same thing with this matchup. So you can see Andrea Lee gets the body lock, hits an outside trip, and Barber goes down very easily. Andrea Lee in the side control. Now, similar to what you saw in the Rebus fight, Barber starts to try and scoot her back over to the cage, but because Lee is wise to this, she doesn't make the same mistake that Rebus did, and instead she starts to pull Barber away. So notice how Barber wants to move towards the cage, Lee wants to move her away from the cage so that she can't wall walk. And obviously from here, inside control, flat on your back, it's much harder to work your way back up to your feet. So if we look at the timeline, because we want to keep this as short as possible, Barber gets taken down with 3 minutes 45 on the clock, and if we skip through, she's been on the ground for a minute at this point, 2 minutes at this point, and Lee is essentially able to hold her down pretty easily. Lee works for the back, doesn't get a body triangle in play, which enables Barber to turn into her and pop back up to her feet. But you can see in that first, 2-3 minutes of this round, Barber gave up a very cheap takedown and looked very, very weak off her back. Now, if we skip through into round 2, we want to just focus on the grappling. So, here you can see nice takedown entry there from Macy. But we know Andrea Lee's very difficult to hold down, so she pops right back up. So then Lee shoots a takedown. And look at how aggressive Barber is, man. So Barber gives up a very cheap takedown here off a single leg. Very cheap. And Lee just kind of flattens her out and moves into side control. So, again, out in the middle of the octagon, you can see that Barber is scrambly off her back, but nowhere near as effective at working her way back up to her feet as she was in the Rebus fight 3 months on from this one. So if we look at the timeline, Barber gets taken down with about 1 minute 50 to go in round 2. And if we skip through, she's very weak off her back and stays on her back till the end of the round. And what's concerning about this is if you think back to what you saw in the Rebus fight, every time Barber got taken down in the Rebus fight, she showed a lot of urgency to work her way back up to her feet, but that isn't what we get here. Here, when Barber is taken down, Lee gives her an opportunity to stand back up with 45 seconds left to go in the round, and Barber doesn't take it. She stays on her back for the entire remainder of the round and enables Lee to jump back into her guard. And so there's a lot more issues in this fight with Barber's takedown offense and ground game than there were in the Rebus fight, and there's only 3 months between these two matchups, which suggests to me Barber is learning from her mistakes. And that's how we all improve, right? We all make mistakes, but it's how you learn from them and improve that's really important, and Barber's clearly improving. So Lee in on a nice double leg there, looks for the back take, gets overly aggressive on the back take, but Barber pops back up to her feet. Very nice. And then we can see Barber takes Lee down. Nice outside trip off a double leg in the side control. Lee right back up. You can see here Lee gets an easy snap down off a single leg. And again she lets Barber back up. Barber hesitates, but she actually backs up a little bit to give Barber the space to stand back up. Then right at the end of the round, Lee with the body lock turns it into another outside trip straight into half guard. Now, obviously, even though Barber is taken down in one of the best positions she has been taken down in this fight, because she's the closest to the cage she has been at any other takedown, which makes it easier for her to wall walk. The fact that Lee has landed in half guard makes it very difficult for Barber, because Lee can put a barrier between the right side of Barber and the cage with her left leg, and can also anchor her body on the right leg of Barber to make it very difficult for Barber to move around on the bottom. She can kind of pin her down with the lower part of her body, and so because of that, Lee holds Barber down for the remainder of the round. That's pretty much what I wanted to show you from Maycee Barber, because I think what we can see from the footage that I've just shown you is that there's big issues with her takedown offense and ground game for sure, but there also appears to be a pretty decent rate of improvement. I think we can all agree that, you know, Barber's takedown offense and ground game looked a lot better against Rebus than it did against Lee. Now, if you think about it, this fight against Rebus was like 2 years ago. So if we're seeing that rate of improvement from Barber in just 3 months in between these two fights, consider how much she could have improved in 2 years since we last saw her, you know, in a grappling heavy fight against Rebus. She could have improved a lot. And I'll go back to what I said earlier on. Blanchfield is an easy fighter to game plan for based on past performances, because she doesn't have the striking to set her takedowns up. You know exactly what she's going to try and do. She wants to get you to the ground, hold you on the ground, which makes it easier to see those takedown entries coming. Now, we also spoke about Blanchfield having a lack of physicality. And this is something that I want to show you in her past fights. And I don't want to spend tons of time on this, because it'll just make this breakdown super long. But the Rose, I hate how Fight Pass auto plays the audio like that. It's very annoying. Sorry about that, guys, if I burst your eardrums. But this fight is a really good example of showing Blanchfield's lack of physicality in grappling positions. So I thought it would be better to show you this in the Rose fight instead of the Mananfuro fight, because we can all accept that Mananfuro is a very physically imposing, strong fighter, more physically imposing than Rose. So where we highlight this in the fight against Rose, it means more than in the fight against Mananfuro. So here we see the first takedown entry of the fight from Blanchfield, and you can see here as well, right, how bad Blanchfield is defensively. Just look at how wide open she is. You've seen short clips of how aggressive and hard Barber hits. Visualize how this fight would look on the feet with Barber stood in front of Blanchfield. Like, look at how vulnerable she is there in those exchanges. Just eating clean, hard shots from Rose. Look at that. Clean, hard shots. But she shoots a double leg. She drives Rose into the cage. And what you'll notice about Blanchfield, which is a little bit strange, is even though she's very short and has that small, compact frame, she often struggles to get in deep on her opponent's legs. And you can see here with this takedown, she's very high up above Rose's hips, which is not where you want to be. Just like when we were analysing the Rebus fight, we said Rebus needs to be in on the legs down here. And as a result, Rose hits that judo throw, winds up in side control. And if we skip through, so there's 3 minutes there, Blanchfield pops right back up. But you can see the Blanchfield just didn't look that physically imposing in that position. And we expect this, right? And again, we'll be talking about this with Merab Dvalishvili next week. Fighters that have amazing cardio, high output, high work rate, they often lack physicality. Merab has that problem. Blanchfield has that problem. Their strength is in their work rate. They wear you down with persistence. They spam the takedowns. They beat you up in the clinch. But in Blanchfield's recent fights against Rose and Furo, she's kind of got away from that. And instead, she only really shoots 1 or 2 takedowns per round. Whereas if you look at Merab, what makes Merab so effective? Like, if you look at the Peter Yan fight, I think he shot like 30 or 40 takedowns. I think he shot like 30 takedowns on Umar Nurmagomedov. He's absolutely relentless. Blanchfield isn't really like that. So with Blanchfield, there's opportunities to beat her, because she doesn't shoot that many takedowns. So if, like Rose, you do neutralize, the 1 or 2 takedowns she does shoot per round, because her striking is so bad, you stand a great chance of actually winning a round against her. Now, Rose wore down in this fight and got tired, but we know Barber's cardio is amazing. That is unlikely to happen with Barber. But if we look here, Rose shoots a takedown, then Blanchfield returns fire. But just in this clinch position, we talk about the clinch position a lot as being a great position to gauge fighter physicality. And you can see here, Blanchfield just doesn't look particularly physically imposing in this position. Rose is quite comfortable here. She's got that overhook on the left side. Blanchfield's not able to get in on the legs. And this doesn't look like a particularly strong or physically imposing takedown for me. She sneaks the right leg in behind the right leg of Rose here. And she hits the outside trip. But nothing particularly scary or impressive about that. And then from top position, Blanchfield gets to work, chipping away at Rose from top position. But again, her top game, her grappling control, it's not crazy physically imposing. Like some fighters have crushing physicality to their ground games. Blanchfield doesn't have that, and it isn't the easiest thing for me to convey to you in this analysis. It's just kind of something you get a read and a feel for after watching thousands of hours of fighting and doing what I do, being totally immersed in the UFC and doing this for a living now for 10 years. And so I can tell you right now, Blanchfield lacks physicality to her grappling. And quite often, when you get fighters like Blanchfield or like a Merab Dvalishvili or like a Belal Muhammad, and they run into fighters that they can't wear down because they have great cardio, and those fighters have reasonably good takedown defense and are very physically imposing and strong and powerful and athletic, a lot of the time they struggle bad. A lot of the time they struggle really bad. And we see it to some extent here. We certainly saw it in the Man and Fioro fight. Reason why Blanchfield really struggled against Fioro was because Fioro was just so much stronger. And here you can see she's struggling against Rose, man. Rose is tired, but she's struggling to impose herself on Rose. We can see that here, but Rose is getting more tired, which is giving Blanchfield opportunities to score points on the feet, because Rose isn't as effective on the feet anymore with how tired she gets. But look, Blanchfield is struggling to get this fight to the ground. She isn't that strong. Small, great cardio, high work rate, great gas tank, all that sort of stuff, but for sure lacks physicality. And if we go into round 5, she does hit a takedown here. Does a good job of pulling Rose off the cage so that Rose can't wall walk. Hits that outside trip. And then at this point, Rose is just too tired to work her way back up to her feet, and Blanchfield spends most of round 5 chipping away at Rose. But even here you can see she gives Rose a space to stand back up. And that's pretty much it. So look, if you want to bet this fight, it comes down to whether you want to bet on past performances, because we can see Barber's takedown offense, ground game against Rebus, and Andrea Lee's not good. Or do you look at this fight and go, damn, if Barber can improve as much as she did in just 3 months between these two fights, imagine what she could improve in 2 years. And so, from a betting point of view, this is a tricky one for me, because with the level of uncertainty around where Barber's takedown offense and ground game is in 2025, I cannot bet Blanchfield at an implied probability of 70%. It just isn't smart. So for me, a bet on Blanchfield is out of the question. Doesn't make sense. But for me, a bet on Barber is also quite speculative, because whilst I do expect improvement from her, Blanchfield could have improved as well. which would negate potential improvements that Barber has made. This is one of those fights where, again, if you want to bet this fight, for me, you have to go dog or pass. Because for me, there's just so much more upside in taking the underdog. That doesn't mean I think Barber's going to win, but I think it would be foolish from a financial point of view to go and bet $1,000 on Erin Blanchfield this weekend for a potential $420 profit when we have absolutely no idea where Maycee Barber's takedown offense and ground game is at in 2025. And if the fight stays standing, Blanchfield is most likely doomed. Whereas you could bet $1,000 on Maycee Barber and you make $1,900 versus $420. Like, in terms of risk to reward ratio, doesn't matter who I think is going to win or lose. Common sense tells us Barber gives you the better risk to reward ratio. So that's how I view this fight. So in terms of the over-under on this one, both girls tough as nails. I'd be surprised if we saw a finish. I think if we do see a finish, it's because Barber has knocked Blanchfield out. You saw how much of a sitting duck Blanchfield is on the feet against Rose. But again, Blanchfield's a tough fucker. It won't be easy to get her out of there. So very likely the fight goes to a decision, and the odds reflect that. Those odds are unbettable. Way too steep. So in terms of props, I wouldn't get cute with this one. The odds on Blanchfield by decision too steep. They're absolutely terrible. The odds on Barber by decision aren't great because in percentage terms they're not a whole lot better than Maycee Barber moneyline for exponentially more risk taking that prop. So I would say if you really want to bet this fight just to make watching it more interesting, I would just take Barber moneyline. But it's not something I'm going to be betting. But if you're thinking of betting this fight this weekend, I really hope you found that analysis useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Mateusz Gamrot versus Ludwig Klein. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Gamrot is the slight favourite at average odds of around 1.60, which is going to be minus 167 for an implied probability of 63%. If we take a look at the odds on Klein, he's around an average of, this is quite a decent odd spread, we'll say 2.35, which is going to be plus 135 for an implied probability of 43%. So Gamrot is 34 years old, 5'10" with a 70-inch reach, and Ludwig Klein, 30 years old, 5'7" with a 72.5-inch reach. So we just spent a lot of time analysing the matchup between Blanchfield and Barber, which was a classic striker versus grappler matchup, and we're doing the same thing again now with Klein and Gamrot because the same principles apply, with Ludwig Klein being predominantly a striker, and we know if the fight stays standing, Klein is going to have a big advantage, and Gamrot predominantly being a grappler, if the fight goes to the ground, Gamrot is going to have a huge advantage. So our analysis in this video is going to focus on what is the probability that Gamrot can get this fight to the ground, keep the fight on the ground, and as ever, I will be showing you fight footage of Gamrot and Klein's recent fights to give us clues as to what is most likely to happen here. Now, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you will know that I've been very critical of Mateusz Gamrot since he came into the UFC. And over the years, I've faced a lot of criticism for this on these breakdown videos. You yourself watching this may have left me some nasty comments in the past on videos where I have been very critical of Gamrot and told me that I'm a clueless fraud that doesn't know anything because Gamrot keeps winning. But when you reach the level of experience that I have in sports betting, I've been betting on sports for 15 years, and every month I watch hundreds of hours of sports across the UFC and football, you gain a very high level knowledge of sports, and you start to learn and understand that luck plays a massive role in sports and the outcome of fights and the outcome of football matches. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because if you go and watch, any roulette table in any casino in the world and you just sit there for a whole day, you sit there for 10 hours, even though we know the probability of the roulette ball landing on either a red or black number is close to 50%, multiple times a day you will see runs where the ball will land on a red number or a black number 10, 15, 20 consecutive times in a row. So it's always interesting to me when sports fans then talk about, sports like the UFC or football in the context of absolutes. And they talk in terms of, if this fight, played out between these two athletes, that's how it was always going to go. That was the most likely way it was going to go. And that fighter absolutely should have won, and that was the most probable outcome, and that's just the way it is. So many sports fans think in this very linear way, but the way that you become profitable in this sport is you cut through all that noise. You do not focus too much on the outcome, and instead you focus on the performances and the skills demonstrated by a fighter, an athlete, a team, because that's where you can find an edge. Everyone can see results of fights. Everyone can see results of football matches. So it's very difficult to find an edge when you're just looking at win-loss records and you go, oh, well, Gamrot appears to be winning a bunch. If I look at Klein's record, he's on a big winning streak. You know what I mean? And that's pretty much the extent of your analysis. Where you can really find an edge in this game is actually looking at the strengths and weaknesses of fighters. And in the case of Gamrot, I do feel a lot of luck and a lot of positive variance has influenced his career in the UFC, because from his days in KSW, he has demonstrated significant weaknesses that didn't catch up with him on a results basis for a long time. But if you go back and watch his past fights, and if you go back and watch me analysing his past fights, right, go on my YouTube channel and watch me break down Gamrot's past fights. These massive weaknesses in Gamrot's skill set have existed since his days in KSW, but it's only now they're starting to catch up with him because he just had a bit of luck on his side and was finding ways to win. He was finding ways to put green on his record, even though his performances didn't warrant it, in my opinion. If you go back, look at his performance against Scott Holtzman, it wasn't good. Holtzman was like 40 years old back there. There was a huge momentum swing in Diego Ferreira's favour just before Diego Ferreira popped the rib out. And so Ferreira kind of got injured in that fight just as he was taking over. The Arman Tsarukyan decision is one of the worst decisions I've seen in the last few years. Any way you dress it up, Tsarukyan won that fight 4 rounds to 1 clear as day. Anyone with eyeballs that understands how to score an MMA fight will tell you that. But then he starts to get found out and his luck runs out, and all his weaknesses were exposed for everyone to see against Beneil Dariush. He was struggling very badly against Jalen Turner, and he's just lucky that Turner had bad fight IQ and gave up cheap takedowns in that fight at critical points, which cost him. He struggled against the 400-year-old Rafael Dos Anjos in this fight, but again, Dos Anjos, similar to Turner, made some bad decisions and gave up takedowns at really bad moments in the fight. And then again, fully exposed against Dan Hooker like he was against Beneil Dariush, where, again, his cardio issues and his lack of physicality on the ground came back to haunt him. And when we talk about issues with Gamrot, these are really the 2 big issues with him. Issue number 1, cardio, not good. If you go and watch all of his past fights dating back to KSW, he slows down a lot as fights wear on. The only fight where it didn't happen was the Tsarukyan fight, which is a total anomaly because Gamrot worked harder in that fight than any other fight that I've ever seen him in. And for some strange reason, he didn't slow down. But if you look at Gamrot in the Tsarukyan fight, and then you immediately watch him against Beneil Dariush, Jalen Turner, Rafael Dos Anjos, or Dan Hooker, it's like looking at 2 different human beings. And again, this is where it's really important not to look at sports betting in a linear fashion and open your mind up to the fact that on any given day, we can see very different things from different fighters. And if this sport or any other sport was easy to predict, we would all be billionaires. But that isn't how this works. And this isn't a perfect world. And every weekend we see fighters look very different to how they have in the past. That was the case with the Tsarukyan fight, but then Gamrot reverted to the norm in the Dariush fight, and ever since. And so when we look at Gamrot's record, and we're working in terms of probabilities, we have to ask ourselves, what is the most likely version of Mateusz Gamrot that shows up this weekend? Are we going to get the absolute cardio machine, the absolute demon that showed up against Arman Tsarukyan and sprinted hard for 25 minutes and didn't slow down at all? Or are we going to get the version of Gamrot that showed up in his other 10 UFC fights that looked mostly dreadful, irrespective of the fact there's a bunch of green on his record, through various different lucky and variance-based reasons, mainly due to bad decision-making his opponents made in fights, or freak injuries in the case of Diego Ferreira, or being old in the case of Jeremy Stephens and Scott Holtzman. And so, when we're analysing how Gamrot matches up with Klein, we've got to be open-minded to the possibility that the version of Gamrot that fought Tsarukyan will show up, because that does exist in history. We haven't seen it in 3 years, but it does exist out there in the universe. And therefore, if Gamrot does show up and perform this weekend against Ludwig Klein like he did against Arman Tsarukyan, no version of Klein that we've ever seen stands a chance. He will get overwhelmed, he will get wet blanketed, he will get dragged to the ground and smothered to death for 3 minutes, and there ain't a whole lot that Ludwig Klein can do about it. But if Gamrot shows up and performs how he has performed in any other fight other than the Tsarukyan one, Klein has a great chance of winning this, because all of the issues that have caused Gamrot a problem in past fights, win or lose, will almost certainly cause him a problem against Ludwig Klein as well. So before we get into showing you footage, I want to make clear statements of Gamrot's weaknesses, so that everyone understands when we're watching the footage of both these guys what we need to analyse and pay attention to. So weakness number 1 with Gamrot, slows down a lot as fights wear on. That's linked to issue number 2, that his offensive wrestling's not the best. He's great at getting guys down. His double leg entries are great. His single leg entries are great. But because his cardio is bad, he doesn't have the cardio to grapple really hard for 3 rounds. And this is why what you often see in Gamrot's fights is he has a lot of success with his grappling early, but he progressively has less success as the fight wears on, because as he gets tired, he can't grapple as hard, so his grappling becomes less effective. So that's issue number 2 with Gamrot. And then obviously his striking suffers because he's tired and sloppy, which means he eats bigger shots on the feet, and he starts having to shoot desperation takedowns from further away, further outside of his opponent's range, and then that's when he starts to really struggle. So Gamrot almost always wins the first half of the fight, almost always loses the second half of the fight, and you wind up in this situation where there's always that swing moment in a Gamrot fight around about, the 7 or 8 minute mark in round 2, where it really depends if Gamrot's done enough up until that point in round 2 to nick round 2 and then kind of survive in round 3 and win a 29-28 decision, or if he can, hit a late takedown at an opportunistic moment late in round 2 like he did against Jalen Turner or Rafael Dos Anjos, which enables him to nick round 2 definitively. That's basically Gamrot's career. And so another thing about Gamrot, similar to what I'll say about Erin Blanchfield, similar to what I'll say about Belal Muhammad, that does make him very beatable, is he's very predictable. You know exactly what he's going to do. Doesn't mean it's easy to stop, because his double leg entries are very good. His offensive wrestling is very good until he gets tired. But you know what to expect. You know Gamrot will mostly bounce around on the outside and avoid engaging, and then commit super hard to a takedown. And then he'll get you down, and if you pop back up, he'll back off and circle away, circle away, circle away. And then he will come right back on top of you. The guys that have a lot of success against Mateusz Gamrot are the guys that don't let him off the hook, like a Dan Hooker or a Beneil Dariush. Because what Gamrot wants to do is commit very hard to his takedown, get you down, and then once you've worked back up to your feet, he wants to just avoid engaging on the feet, so he can basically catch his breath, recharge his batteries for the next offensive wrestling assault. The guys that have a lot of success against Gamrot are the ones that stay on his ass and don't give him any breathing space, like your Dan Hookers. Every time Gamrot would shoot a takedown on Hooker, or every time he would take Hooker down and Hooker would get back up or stuff the takedown, Hooker immediately crowded Gamrot and pressured him and forced him to exchange, which made it difficult for Gamrot to catch his breath and continue that cycle of shooting takedowns, recovery, shooting takedowns, recovery. That's the pattern that Gamrot wants to fight at. And so that's a very predictable pattern. That's easy to train for, easy to predict for. It's not easy to stop, but you can absolutely know what to expect. And Ludwig Klein should absolutely know what to expect this weekend. So, in terms of striking, we know Klein's a technician. He's a sniper. He should school Gamrot on the feet. This will not be a contest. So what I want to show you now is the issues with Gamrot's offensive wrestling. And I want to show you Klein's takedown defense. But then I want to show you a nuanced angle in this fight, which could potentially give Gamrot opportunities to win. Because we want to keep our mind wide open when it comes to analysing these UFC fights. Consider all possibilities. And this is why we're so successful when it comes to live betting on the UFC. This is why we absolutely crush and make a profit on most events. Because we think extremely deeply about this sport on a level that 99% of people watching this sport don't think on. We also research so much. We spend so much time researching these fighters so that when these fights are taking place live, we can almost see into the future and know what to expect in rounds that are coming up based on what we've seen these guys do in the past. And this is a brilliant fight for live betting because we've got a lot of footage available on both Gamrot and Klein to know how this fight is likely to progress as it moves on. So if you're not in the live betting group, ask yourself why the fuck not. This is one of the best looking charts you're ever going to see in anything. The worst you can expect over the last 10 years is break even. And in the world of sports betting, that's pretty fucking impressive. We basically never had a dip. So if you watch every UFC event live, get on board. Why aren't you in this group? It's an absolute no-brainer over the long term. It will undoubtedly pay it for itself and you will have an amazing time. So we want to look at the footage now. We want to look at what we're dealing with Klein and Gamrot. And so we're going to start off by taking a look at one of Ludwig Klein's recent fights against Thiago Moises. Now again, we can't look at this sport or any of these fights through a linear lens. We need to think in terms of depth and complexity and nuance. And so obviously, it goes without saying that Thiago Moises is a very different grappler to Mateusz Gamrot. Very different styles of grappling, very different styles of takedown entry. We can't look at them in the same way and assume just because Klein has done a good job of neutralizing the threat of Moises' grappling, he's going to be able to do a good job of neutralizing the threat of Gamrot's grappling. But what this fight does show us is that Klein is pretty good at reading takedown entries and understands all the basic fundamentals of what you should do when defending takedowns. When we were analysing the Macy Barber and Amanda Ribas fight, we spoke about fundamental mistakes that both Barber and Ribas made. There are none of them with Ludwig Klein. He's very, very well trained, and you can see it here. So, midway through round one, very, very, very nice takedown entry from Moises. Very nice takedown entry. Look at this. Throughout this video, where we've been talking about a lot of strikers and grapplers, we have talked about the importance of getting in deep on the legs. When you see an Erin Blanchfield or an Amanda Ribas working for takedowns at this height, it's no good. It's not what you want. Because at the end of the day, if you think about a game of Jenga, right? It's so much easier to remove the pieces from the top of the Jenga tower and the Jenga tower not topple over than if you start to remove the pieces down the bottom, right? You start to remove the pieces down the bottom, that Jenga tower is going to topple over very quickly. Same principle with offensive wrestling, MMA grappling, takedowns. Look at how deep Thiago Moises gets in on this takedown entry. It's a beautiful entry. If I had never watched this fight before, and you freeze framed this still for me here, and you said, Chris, what's the probability that this guy in the black shorts takes down this guy in the blue shorts? And I didn't know anything about these two guys. I would say guy in the black shorts is hitting this takedown 80% of the time. It's such a well-timed entry. He's in so deep on the hips. But Klein shows incredible balance, incredible athleticism to clear his legs and sprawl out of it. Super impressive. Then Moises tries to walk him over to the cage. And again, Klein does a really good job of keeping good distance between his legs and the arms and the legs of Moises. And he has that underhook on the right side the whole way, making it very difficult for Moises to drop back down and get in on the legs. He then digs the underhook on the left side. There he goes. Left side secure. Double underhooks in play. And because of that, Moises has absolutely nothing from this position. And he's going to be forced to let this position go, because the double underhooks completely neutralizes the threat of the takedown. Technically perfect from Klein. Absolutely brilliant takedown defense. So whilst Thiago Moises and Mateusz Gamrot are very different MMA grapplers, how Klein deals with the threat of Moises' takedowns and grappling tells us a lot about how he may potentially deal with Gamrot's takedown offense, takedowns and offensive wrestling, and how much success he may have against Gamrot. So we then go into round 2, and we see more good stuff from Klein. We just skip through. Again, we don't want to make this breakdown super long, so we're not going to be watching all the striking. We're just skipping through. Here's a takedown attempt from Moises. Minute and 20 left to go in round 2. Again, unbelievable entry from Moises. I will even say this, and I will get cooked for this in the comments by the dum-dums, but I will even say this. Is Thiago Moises as good of a wrestler as Mateusz Gamrot? Absolutely not. Gamrot, much better MMA grappler than Moises. However, we cannot look at this sport in a linear lens. And if you're looking at this objectively, Thiago Moises' takedown entries are so much better than what you get from Gamrot. And Gamrot's takedown entries are good. They're very good, don't get me wrong. But these entries from Moises are picture perfect spectacular. These are the type of takedowns that are close to impossible to stuff. And yet Klein stuffs him. Shows him strong hips, gets his back over to the cage, gets that underhook on the left side, gets the underhook on the right side. And again, Thiago Moises forced to give it up. So good, so impressive. Just amazing. Absolutely amazing. So Klein then gets his takedown, and we go into round 3. So again, we want to focus on the grappling. Is another takedown entry here. And again, a beautiful entry from Moises. Look at that, double leg. Not as good of an entry as the previous 2, but still very deep in on the legs. But again, look at the technique from Klein. Good balance, keeps his legs underneath him, and Moises is in deep on them legs. But as soon as he gets his back to the cage, watch what Klein does. Underhooks. Boom, double underhooks. And Moises is absolutely cooked. Absolutely cooked. Look at this. Look at that. Double underhooks. Look at that. Double underhooks. Absolutely cooked. Amazing takedown defense from Klein. And look here. Look at that. Gets taken down briefly. Immediately pops back up to his feet. It's such good takedown defense. And then he gets his own little spell in top position here. Very, very nice. So now what we need to focus on is Mateusz Gamrot's offensive wrestling. So now we've seen a good amount of footage on Ludwig Klein's takedown defense, dealing with quite literally top tier elite takedown entries against Thiago Moises. What you can now start to do as you watch a bit of footage on Mateusz Gamrot is visualize how Gamrot may match up against Klein, and how Klein may deal with Gamrot's offensive wrestling takedown entries when Gamrot starts to try and shoot in on his legs. So we are going to focus on Gamrot's last fight, and again, don't want to make this breakdown super long, so we're only going to focus on this fight, because what you see from Gamrot in this matchup against Hooker is generally what you'll see from Gamrot in the vast majority of his fights in the UFC. So where we spoke about that Sarukian fight being a bit of an anomaly, in his other 10 fights, you're pretty much going to get what you see here. So again, what we're focusing on is the takedown entries and the offensive wrestling of Gamrot. So here we go. First takedown entry. Jumps in on a single leg. Ankle picks hooker. But one thing you will notice, and again, this video would be like, this breakdown alone would be well over an hour long if I went into a lot of detail on this. But if you go back and watch any of Gamrot's past fights, including the Sarukian one, what you'll notice is, unless he's fighting someone with a very weak ground game like a Jalen Turner, or is very old like a Rafael dos Anjos, generally what you'll see is what we see from Hooker here. When he gets a takedown, guys are able to move around on the bottom and get back up pretty easily. And this is one of the reasons why Gamrot has bad cardio. He doesn't necessarily have bad cardio, but he slows down a lot in fights because he commits so much energy to getting the takedown that because he doesn't have the physicality to hold guys down for very long, he exerts all this energy to get his opponent down, only for them to stand up very quickly, which means he then has to commit a bunch of energy to get them back down. And generally speaking with Gamrot, the more you can, or the quicker you can pop back up to your feet, the faster he'll get tired, which is why he got so tired against guys like Beneil Dariush and Dan Hooker, because he wasn't able to hold them down for very long. So you can see here, and this is, we mentioned this earlier in the background, earlier in the breakdown. The main reason why Gamrot struggled so much against Dariush and Hooker is because they showed him no respect. Remember what we said, Gamrot wants to fight in a repeatable pattern and a very predictable style where he commits very hard to the takedown, commits a bunch of energy to getting you to the ground, but then when you're back up, he wants to avoid engaging, to catch his breath, recharge his batteries, so that he's got the energy to commit hard to another grappling campaign. The way you have a lot of success against Gamrot, you stay on his ass. And that's exactly what Hooker does here. Watch. As they disengage, Hooker right back on top of him, walking him down. And look, from here, Gamrot can't shoot takedowns now. Because look at his body language. His mouth is already open wide. He's already visually breathing hard. And we're not even 3 minutes into the fight. Look at his body language. Mouth open wide. And he's just trying to catch his breath. But Hooker ain't playing the game. Hooker's on top of him, forcing him to engage. And he's not giving him any breaks. So Gamrot snaps him back down here. But again, relatively quickly, Hooker's able to work his way back up to his feet. And this is how you really cause Gamrot a problem. And watch what happens when they disengage. So Gamrot takes a big visible deep breath. Take a look at Gamrot's body language as they disengage from this position. Big visible deep breath. And what happens? Hooker right back on top of him. Forcing him on the back foot, pressuring him, forcing him to engage. This is how you cause Gamrot big problems. Now the problem is, Ludwig Klein's not really that type of fighter. Ludwig Klein's not an aggressive pressure fighter like a Hooker or a Beneil Dariush. Ludwig Klein's one of these guys that wants to stand in the middle of the octagon and chip away at you and pick you apart. Probably because he's a big muscular guy with a lot of power. He probably needs to conserve energy as well and pace himself, right? So whereas Hooker's a cardio machine that has built a career from forcing guys to fight at a very high pace and sprint for 15 minutes, Klein isn't like that. Klein much more of a sniper, much more of a technician. So obviously Hooker made Gamrot work very, very hard in round one, which means we already know Gamrot is showing signs of slowing down. Before he got rocked at the end of that round, he was already showing signs of slowing down. And what happens when Gamrot starts to slow? Same thing that happens in every fight apart from the Sarukian one. He starts to shoot from very far outside of his opponent's range. And we see that there, which means he doesn't get anywhere near the legs of Hooker. Hooker's able to just easily back up and clear his legs. Now, when you start to think about how good Klein's takedown defense was against Thiago Moises, in the face of elite takedown entries from Moises deep into the third round, you have to start to ask yourself the question, does Gamrot have the offensive wrestling to take Klein down past round one? Based on past performances, outside of the Sarukian anomaly, he probably doesn't. But he's hit a takedown here early in round 2. Hooker takes advantage of this bit of space that Gamrot gives him to scramble over to the cage. Works his way back up to his feet. And now in the second half of this fight, we're in that position we spoke about earlier in the breakdown, where Gamrot is one of these guys who we know will almost always win round 1. The irony is he didn't in this fight because he got knocked down. But he almost always wins round 1. Almost always puts in a serviceable performance in the first half of round 2. And the outcome of his fights usually come down to whether or not he's got enough in the tank to have done enough in the first half of round 2 to win the round, or if he's got enough in the tank to steal round 2 with a cheeky takedown, something like that. But look at his body language here with 2 minutes 22 left to go in round 2 as they disengage. Big visible deep breath coming up. Take a look at this. Watch this. Big visible deep breath. And this is how you beat Gamrot. What Gamrot wants to do now is circle away from you for about a minute. And then with about a minute, 40-50 seconds left to go in the round, he's going to commit very hard to a takedown to try and steal the round, get you back to the ground. The way you beat Gamrot is you don't give him that break. You stay on his ass and you do what Hooker does and you pressure him so that he can't recover, he can't catch his breath, and that makes it much harder for him to summon the energy to commit very hard to that takedown late in this round, which will give him a chance of stealing round 2. And you can see Hooker just walking him down, forcing him to engage. And you can even see there another big visible deep breath. Gamrot throws that combination, and watch this deep breath here. There it is. And these are the kind of things that give us such a huge edge in live betting. The reason why we make a profit almost every week in UFC live betting over the last 10 years is because we can read these subtle signs and we pay attention to these small patterns, these small subtle momentum swings. And we actually did live bet Dan Hooker in this fight, I believe, at underdog odds, and made a profit, because this is where our edge lies, having a deep understanding of how the sport works and being able to analyze these fighters and these matchups on a very, very deep level. So when you see someone like Gamrot starting to shoot these takedowns from quite far outside of Hooker's range, you know it's going to be easier for Hooker to see those takedown entries come in and sprawl out of them, you know, get those underhooks in play nice and early, and just make life very difficult for Gamrot. And you can imagine, you know, you look at this takedown entry from Hooker. Sorry, you look at this takedown entry from Gamrot. You know, they're nowhere near as difficult to deal with as the Thiago Moises takedown entries. So if, you know, we're seeing Klein deal so well with those takedown entries from Moises, good chance past round 1, he's going to have a pretty good amount of success dealing with these takedown entries from Gamrot. And earlier in this breakdown, we also spoke about a lack of physicality to Gamrot's grappling. And you see it in this position here where he just doesn't look that strong in this position. He struggles to hold guys down. Hooker's able to get those underhooks in play nice and easily. Gamrot's worn down and tired at this point, to the extent that Hooker looks very comfortable here. And we know how much of a tank and a powerhouse and an athletic freak Ludwig Klein is. And again, Gamrot looking tired, wants to circle away, catch his breath, mouth open wide, struggle city. And then if we go into round 3, again, we're just going to skim through this, because for the most part it's more of the same. You know, single leg entry here from Gamrot. Hooker does a good job keeping his balance until he gets over to the cage. The irony is then Gamrot doesn't get in on as deep of a takedown attempt, but hits it. But then again, Hooker doesn't allow him to hold him down for very long. Immediately pops back up to his feet. And again, how you beat Gamrot? Stay on his ass. Don't give him recovery time. And I think that's what I'm fearful of with Ludwig Klein. Klein isn't a pressure fighter. He will just look to chip away at Gamrot in that kickboxing range in the middle of the octagon, which will give Gamrot opportunities to recover. Which, isn't really how you gain a big edge over Gamrot and really stack the odds in your favour of beating him. But Klein certainly has much better takedown defence than Hooker, so, you know, that somewhat makes up for it. So nice single leg entry here from Gamrot, but again, Hooker just sprawls out of it, and Gamrot just looking very flat, very tired. We see here another single leg entry, but just very flat, lacking physicality. And this is against a long, tall guy like Hooker. Klein is a tank. It won't be easy to get in on the legs of Klein like this. We saw how good he was at clearing his legs against Moises. So, we've spoken a lot about the things that Klein does well and his path to victory, and we've been very critical of Mateusz Gamrot. But again, we don't want to look at this sport or any sport through a linear lens. We need to think big and be very open-minded to all possibilities. That's how we make so much money live betting on this sport. But if you want to pre-fight bet this fight, right now you might be thinking, well, based on what I've seen, Ludwig Klein's a pretty damn good bet, because his takedown defense looks bulletproof, and Gamrot's offensive wrestling gets a bit shit past the second half of kind of round 2. But this sport has a lot of depth to it and a lot of nuance. And what you will also notice about the Hooker fight that we just watched is, even though Gamrot was taking deep breaths in that fight from the first 3.5 minutes, he still persistently grappled for 3 rounds, and he also made Hooker work hard. So the reason why Gamrot lost that fight is ultimately because Hooker didn't wear down. And that's where the Blanchfield Barber fight gets interesting, right? Barber won't wear down in the same way that Rose Namajunas did. And so the difference between Hooker and Klein is that Gamrot's relentless, all-out assault with MMA wrestling wasn't enough to beat Hooker, because Hooker couldn't be worn down with that style. Just the same as Beneil Dariush didn't really get worn down with that style. But it's possible Klein might be worn down with that style. And that's where this fight gets interesting. So what I'm now going to show you is a fight from a long time ago, to be fair. But what we have seen from Ludwig Klein is issues with him in 2 fights in particular. So, Klein is obviously very high level striker, very good takedown defense. But we know that it's very difficult to fight at the pace that Gamrot sets for 15 minutes. And so we have seen a situation where a fighter used a grappling heavy game plan to wear Ludwig Klein down to the point where he really struggled. And that fight, it's actually happened twice. He won one of the fights, he lost the other. So I'm not going to show you both fights, because it'll just make this breakdown video super long. But if you want to see what I'm talking about, go and watch Ludwig Klein's fights against both Mason Jones and Nate Landwehr. He won the Mason Jones fight, but he was struggling. And he was only able to win the Mason Jones fight through like flash knockdowns. Jones outworked him in rounds 2 and 3. But we're going to focus on the Landwehr fight here. So this fight starts out like you'd expect. Klein lighting Landwehr up on the feet. Klein being a far superior striker. We knew Klein had a big advantage when it came to striking. And you even see here, right, underhooks in play early doors anytime Landwehr threatens with grappling. But Landwehr stayed on Klein, forced him to work very hard, and wore him down. So we're just going to skim through this, because we already know a lot about the technique of Klein when it comes to takedown defense. This fight is more to show you the path to victory for Gamrot. So Landwehr puts Klein in the clinch, and he just starts to wear on him. just starts to force him to battle for position, defend takedowns with underhooks. You know, he goes to the body with his knees. He just starts to wear him down. And if we skip ahead, you know, there's not a whole lot of grappling in the first round, but a little bit of clinch work, few knees to the body, and Landwehr, for the most part, is just out-hustling Klein and wearing him down. And if we go to round 2, we get a lot more grappling. So here you can see Klein still looking very sharp, still looking very technical, still has that sniper style on the feet. You see that in this combination here at the beginning of round 2. Very nice. But then Landwehr thinks, fuck this. I'm just going to get this fight to the ground or wear this guy out in the clinch. So this is about 30 seconds into round 2. So now we can see, if we just skip through, Landwehr just wears on Klein and forces him to battle for position. Right? And now in the second half of round 2, Klein starts to look a little bit flatter. And it's no surprise, right? Like, look at the muscles of Klein. Big old muscles, big arms, and that hasn't changed. And we know guys with Klein's body type typically tend to slow down as fights wear on. We haven't seen Klein slow down in a fight for a long time because he's been able to dictate the pace of the fight. And no doubt Klein's cardio has improved, but we also haven't seen anyone make Klein work as hard as Landwehr did in this matchup. So again, you can see Landwehr just wearing on Klein. And Klein's forced to take a knee to defend against those elbows. And then Landwehr starts attacking with chokes and all kinds of shit. But just stays on Klein in these positions and just wears him down. And now you can start to see very tired body language from Klein. You know, look at the size of his arms. Looks like a goddamn Slovakian superhero. Is he Slovakian? Need to fact check that. He's something like that. Slovakian, bang on. General knowledge point. Well done. So, you see Landwehr go back to the clinch here and just wears on him. Just wears him down. You can start to see Klein looking tired and sloppy here. Heavy arms. Look how heavy and tired his arms look. And if we go in the round, you know, you can see Klein just Landwehr just stays on his ass. Now if we go in the round 3, similar sort of thing. In fact, Klein was worn down so much the Landwehr did actually start to strike with him in this round. And then you can see Klein kind of just gives up the choke that Landwehr was fishing for in round 2. And he taps. Probably through exhaustion, to be fair. Just didn't want to be in there anymore. Kind of gave the choke up. You see by the expression on his face, he's like, fuck, I got tired. It happens, right? So, that's what makes this fight very interesting. The reason why Hooker was able to drag Gamrot into deep water and drown him was the Hooker had the cardio to cope with the pace that Gamrot was forcing him to fight at. Based on the Mason Jones and Nate Landwehr fights, Klein may not have the cardio to fight at the pace that Gamrot fights at. And the difference between Gamrot and Klein is that even though Gamrot looks shit in a lot of his fights, he's very used and comfortable to feeling like he felt against Hooker and fighting like he fought against Hooker. Even after being knocked down in round 1, he was still pushing a crazy pace in round 3. Even after all the damage and all the shots the Hooker landed on him, Gamrot still had his head in the game and was trying to win. When you look at the difference in what Gamrot tried to do in that third round against Dan Hooker compared to that third round between Klein and Landwehr, and I would say if this fight turns into a war of attrition where both guys get very tired, I trust Gamrot way more to push through and get the job done. The problem with assessing how significant the Mason Jones and Landwehr fights are, in the context of how this matchup against Gamrot is likely to go, is that they were such a long time ago that Klein's cardio could have improved a lot since then. The Mason Jones fight was around 3 years ago, and we know fighters are on continuous journeys of self-improvement. Maybe Klein's diet is better, maybe his strength and conditioning is better. We always have to work with incomplete sets of information, and my gut tells me that if you make Klein work hard, he will slow. Why do I say that? You just have to look at his body type. Now, yes, you get unicorns in MMA like Kamaru Usman, who can have insane big old muscles and not get tired, but they're really fucking rare. Generally speaking, when you have a guy like Ludwig Klein with a very muscular body type, if you make them work hard, if you make them exert a lot of energy, they will slow down a lot as fights wear on. It's difficult for us to say either way with Klein, because in the last 3 years, none of these guys have really made Klein grapple hard. Moises shot good takedown entries, but it was only 1 or 2 takedowns per round. It wasn't like Gamrot, who's going to be relentlessly trying to wet blanket him and wear him out and beat him up. So it's a complex fight. I will say the same about this fight that I said about the Barber versus Blanchfield fight. You do have to be insane to bet Gamrot, in my opinion, because, with how good Klein's takedown defense has looked, if his cardio does hold up, Gamrot has almost no chance to win, in my opinion. So why would I want to bet $1,000 on him to win $600 when I could bet on Klein, having his takedown defense hold up after 3 years since the Mason Jones fight, and having his takedown defense look as good as it did against Thiago Moises, and bet $1,000 to win $1,400 profit, right? If we look at both these guys, there's significant risks to betting on both of them. So why would you want to bet $1,000 to win $600 when you could bet $1,000 to win $1,400? If you're going to take on a lot of risk with either guy you bet, you may as well take on a lot of risk and have a much bigger payout and earn a lot more money for the risk you're putting up. That's my philosophy. But let me know what you think on the Discord. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Maybe you disagree. So for me, this fight is clearly dog or pass. But we need to look at the over-under on this one. Let me just refresh the page. Make sure we got the latest odds. So the over-under, pretty steep favourite odds. Personally, this is another one where I would let the odds do the work for me. And I would just take fight doesn't go to a decision. The logic being, you could see a situation where Klein becomes too tired to defend himself and Gamrot gets a stoppage on the ground, either through ground and pound or submission, or Gamrot might become too tired to defend himself and Klein just lands that kill shot which sends him to the Shadow Realm. I know Gamrot's tough, I know he's not easy to put away, but Klein's got far more power than guys like Dariush and Dan Hooker. Now in terms of the prop bets, Klein by decision is an interesting one. At 4.0 plus 300. I'd personally prefer just to take the money line and not get greedy. But those odds aren't bad if you're looking to sprinkle a little bit of money on this fight. So, hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Billy Ray Goff versus Ramiz Brahimaj. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Goff is the favourite at average odds of about 1.28, which is going to be minus 357 for an implied probability of 78%. And if we take a look at the odds on Brahimaj, he is around an average of 3.65, which is going to be plus 265 for an implied probability of 27%. So Goff is 26 years old, 5'10" with a 72.5-inch reach, and Brahimaj, 32 years old, 5'10" with a 73-inch reach. So no notable X factors on this one. Obviously, it's a short notice fight for both guys, but they were both training and prepared for different opponents on this same card. I'll keep this short. We spent a lot of time breaking down some other fights on this card. I'll save you the time. I really like Goff in this fight. I really like Goff in general. Goff is my type of fighter. He's well-rounded, he's tough, and he fights at a high pace. Goff is one of these guys that just looks to come out and engage you from the first bell to the last. He's super aggressive, very high output, very consistent, tough as nails, good cardio, reasonably good everywhere. The guy's a demon. I like him a lot. In fact, I was considering a bet on him when he was scheduled to fight Shuk Hyun Ko, which was scheduled for this weekend, and then he got cancelled. So this is a fight where I think Goff is better than Brahimaj everywhere. You know, from a pure MMA grappling point of view, Brahimaj might have the edge, but he can't match the work rate of Goff. So I really, really like Goff in this fight. Goff should win this fight, standing up or on the ground. He deserves to be a big favourite. I don't really know what else to tell you. In terms of the over-under, we don't have odds for that yet. And we don't have odds for the full range of props. So that might be the shortest breakdown video I've ever recorded. But let's move on to the next one. So now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Bruno Lopes versus Dustin Jacoby. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Jacoby is the favourite at average odds of about 1.54, which is going to be minus 185 for an implied probability of 65%. And if we take a look at the odds on Lopes, he's around an average of 2.50, which is going to be plus 150 for an implied probability of 40%. Lopes is 32 years old, 6'2", with a 74-inch reach. Jacoby, 37 years old, 6'3" with a 76-inch reach. So both guys are about the same size, but there is a notable difference in age. It's only 5 years, but these guys are at the stage in their careers where that 5-year difference can count for a lot. So Jacoby in his late 30s, we know he's going to be declining from fight to fight, whereas Lopes, 32 years old, he's still in his prime, still should be improving from fight to fight. So that does give Lopes a bit of an X factor on his side and a bit of an edge going into this matchup. So classic striker versus grappler matchup. I feel like we've said that a lot on this card. And Lopes is the grappler. If he's able to get this fight to the ground, he's going to have a big advantage. But Jacoby is the striker. If he keeps the fight standing, he will have a big advantage. And so our analysis again in this video will focus on what probability Jacoby has of keeping the fight on the feet and neutralizing the threat of Lopes' grappling. So we'll quickly run through the striking. Jacoby does have a big advantage when it comes to striking, even at 37 years old, because Lopes is one of these flat-footed, slow, stuck in the mud light heavyweights that doesn't move his head very much. And even though Jacoby's 37, he's still a lot more technical than Lopes. On top of that, Lopes isn't the most dangerous offensively. So whereas Jacoby may be starting to get rocked and wobbled and dropped a lot in his recent fights due to his chin probably declining at this stage in his career, I'm not saying that Lopes can't hurt him on the feet because he's a big old Brazilian, but he is very slow, he is very sloppy and just not at all technical when it comes to striking. So Jacoby has a huge advantage when it comes to striking here. But Lopes is a pretty good MMA grappler. And what I really like about Lopes is, even though he's slow and flat-footed and stuck in the mud, his cardio is very good and he's got good persistent grappling, which means he can continue to grapple hard for the full 3 rounds. So even if he struggles a bit to get takedowns early, he can keep it going and keep trying to get the fight to the ground, which obviously increases his probability of winning by getting the fight to the ground. Lopes' problem is, because he is a little bit stiff and flat and slow, he's not the most dynamic MMA grappler. He does struggle to get in deep on the legs of his opponents, but if he does get you down and he does get on top of you, his grappling control is pretty good. The problem we have with assessing the probability of both of these guys winning this matchup is that Jacoby is one of those fighters that, even though he's had a lot of fights in the UFC, we haven't really seen his takedown defense tested that much. If you look at his record, for the most part, he's fought strikers or well-rounded fighters that didn't try to take him down that much, or grapplers that didn't try to take him down that much. Petrino, predominantly a striker, didn't really try to take him down very much. The Reyes fight ended in 2 minutes. Menafield shot the odd takedown, but again didn't try and take him down very much. And Chukwu striker, Mirzakhanov striker, Khalil Roundtree striker. This fight ended in 3 minutes. Alexejczyk striker, Allen very low level, Darren Stewart striker. And so, you know, the last time he fought a semi-decent wrestler was all the way back in 2021, 4 years ago, against Ion Cutelaba, which makes it very difficult to know where Jacoby's takedown defense is at in 2025. So what I can tell you is, on the odd occasion, on the odd situation where guys have shot takedowns on Jacoby, like Mennefield shot a takedown on him. Jacoby tends to be one of these guys that you can get down, but he does look very difficult to hold down. It's impossible for us to say how Jacoby would deal with someone that would use chain wrestling against him, or how he would deal if someone actually got him down and put him on his back, because some guys have pretty good takedown offense and they're pretty good at working their way back up to their feet if you take them down up against the cage. But then if you take them down out in the middle of the octagon, they really struggle. It's impossible to say if Jacoby's like that because we've never seen him in that position, but we'll find out this weekend. One thing I would say is sometimes when fighters get into their late 30s and they start to decline, their balance does start to go. And so even though Jacoby has looked difficult to take down and hold down in the past, he is a long rangey guy that, you know, guys with this body type are typically easier to hold down than guys that aren't as long and rangy. So if his balance does start to go now he's in his late 30s, this could potentially be a very difficult fight for Jacoby, but we don't know either way because right now we just don't have the footage available on Jacoby to give us a definitive answer. So based on past performances, I understand why Jacoby is the favourite. He does have a big advantage when it comes to striking, and based on past performances, it won't be easy for Lopes to get Jacoby down and hold him down. But with him being 37 years old and Lopes being in his prime, we have to be very open-minded to the fact that Jacoby may have declined to the point where Lopes could have a lot more success on the feet than his past performances suggest is likely. So if you're betting this fight this weekend, just keep all that in mind. Similarly to my feelings on betting Erin Blanchfield, Mateusz Gamrot this weekend, I don't see any upside in taking Jacoby as a pretty big favourite. Why would you risk $1,000 to make $550 profit when you could bet $1,000 on Lopes to make $1,500 profit? Given there's a lot of risk in betting either guy on this fight, you may as well take the, you may as well take the underdog for the better risk to reward ratio. But I wouldn't personally bet this fight because in order for Lopes to win this, we're going to have to see decline in Jacoby at a level we haven't really seen in him. And so it wouldn't feel appropriate or smart for us to write Jacoby off before we start to see, cold hard evidence that his balance is going and cold hard evidence that his takedown offense isn't as good as the flashes of takedown offense from him, which has looked good here and there in some of his past fights of the recent, recent few years. So that's how I feel about this one. I'm not going to be betting this fight, but I hope you found that analysis useful. In terms of the over-under on this one, it's quite likely this fight goes to a decision, in my opinion. If it does end inside the distance, I think it'll be Jacoby knocking Lopes out. Lopes is a bit of a sitting duck on the feet, very slow, very bad defensively, doesn't see the shots coming. He actually did get dropped on his Contender Series fight. So even though Jacoby's not the most dangerous striker, doesn't have the most power in his hands, the skill gap on the feet between these two is so big that I still think Jacoby could hurt him pretty bad and knock him out. So, I would lean more towards this fight going to a decision, but I wouldn't bet it. I don't have a strong feeling either way. In terms of the prop bets, I think most likely outcome is Jacoby by decision. So if you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on this fight to make watching him more interesting, then you might want to go for that. I don't have odds on Jacoby to win by knockout or TKO yet. That could be something you want to think about as well. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Dusko Todorovic versus Zach Reese. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Zach Reese is the favourite at average odds of about 1.40, which is going to be minus 250 for an implied probability of 71%. And if we take a look at the odds on Todorovic, he's around an average of 2.90, maybe 3.0, which is plus 200 for an implied probability of 33%. So Todorovic is 31 years old, 6'1" with a 74-inch reach. And Reese, 31 years old, 6'4", with a 77-inch reach. So we can see Reese with a bit of a size and reach advantage here, with both guys the exact same age. So this is a real interesting clash of styles, because with Todorovic, you've got a guy that is an absolute sitting duck to the knockout on the feet. Doesn't move his head very much, very bad defensively, doesn't see the shots coming. And in Reese, you've got a dangerous striker. Devastating kicking game, hits very hard, inflicts a lot of damage with everything that he throws. His nickname Savage is quite fitting because he is nasty when it comes to striking. So this is one of those matchups where Todorovic will be at constant risk of being knocked out if this fight stays standing, and he will need to get this fight to the ground if he wants to win. Reese is one of these guys that has pretty bad takedown defense and a pretty bad ground game. He's very weak off his back. If you take Reese down, put him on his back, he's pretty easy to hold down and control. So at this point, you're probably thinking, well, Reese is a big favourite. Todorovic is a big underdog. You've just told me that Reese is very bad on the ground. So should I be considering a bet on Todorovic here? The problem with Todorovic is that he's one of these very frustrating fighters that, for some reason, even though his chin is very bad and his defense is even worse, and he gets rocked, wobbled, and dropped in every fight, for some reason, Todorovic is one of these guys that is very reluctant to grapple. Todorovic is one of those guys that needs to be knocked out almost three or four times and suffer 12 concussions before he'll actually shoot a takedown. So the problem with Todorovic is he quite often gets knocked out or takes too much damage to the point the fight is irrecoverable before he'll actually consider going into his grappling. And that's what makes this fight a tricky one, because Todorovic absolutely has the skills to win. If he came into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, I would favour Todorovic, but you can't trust him to grapple. He's just one of those guys like a Curtis Blades that fucks around way too much on the feet and quite often pays for it with brain cells. So this is one of those matchups which is definitely dog or pass. You wouldn't want to be betting Zach Reese at an implied probability of, in that 70% range. That's absurd. For a guy as bad on the ground as Reese is, you do not want to be betting him in this odds range. It's just crazy talk. But if you do bet Todorovic in this matchup, you're taking on a lot of risk because you're basically trusting a guy to grapple that never grapples or very rarely grapples, and usually only grapples if things get really bad for him and then he manages to survive, which he often doesn't. So this is one of those matchups, no matter who you go with, you're not putting your money in a strong position. But again, just let the odds do the work for you. Why would you want to bet on a guy, where if you risk $1,000, you make $400 profit, and we know he's got no takedown defense and ground game? It just doesn't make any sense to me at all. So we don't have the props yet. We don't have the over-unders. So if you're in my Discord and you want me to give my thoughts on the props, the over-unders for this event, slide by later on in the week when they're available on this website, and I will go through them for you. But for now, we will move on to the next fight. Now let's break down the fight between Klein Vieira and Chiasson. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Chiasson is the favourite at average odds of about 1.85, which is going to be minus 118 for an implied probability of 54%. If we take a look at the odds on Vieira, she's around an average of 1.95, which is going to be minus 105 for an implied probability of 51%. So Vieira is 33 years old, 5'8" with a 68-inch reach. And Chiasson, 33 years old, 5'11" with a 72-inch reach. So we can see Chiasson, decent size advantage and a very nice 4-inch reach advantage as well. So what's interesting about these two is that we can talk a lot about how fighters match up stylistically and who's the better striker and who's the better grappler. But GSP famously said that fighting was 90% mental. And we see this every week. In the live betting group, the mentality of the fighters, the strategy, the game plan, the fight IQ is what decides the outcome of a fight a huge percentage of the time. And so when we are live betting these fights, we focus a lot on what fighters are likely to do based on their path to victory, but also based on their fight IQ and decision making. And so even though both Klein Vieira and Chiasson have strengths and weaknesses over one another, with the kind of fighters that these two girls are, the outcome of their matchups will almost always be determined by which version of them shows up on the night and how their fight IQ holds up on the night and their decision making. And so if we start to take a look at their records, it does paint a picture as to the kind of fighters that these are. So if we start with Ketlen Vieira, you guys know that when you see a fighter that frequently fights to split decisions, it quite often tells us a lot about their mentality. So if we look at Ketlen Vieira, she's had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 fights in the UFC. And within those 12 fights, she's been to a split decision 4 times. So 30% of her fights go to a split decision. She wins some, she loses some. And not only that, but her last 7 fights have gone to a decision against a wide range of opponents, different styles and different ability levels. When you see a fighter like Ketlen Vieira go to a split decision very often, and that is becoming a bit of a trend, especially if they go into decisions a lot against a diverse range of opponents, what that usually says is that they're quite passive and they struggle to put their stamp on rounds. And when you look at Vieira's past performances, that is 100% reaffirmed in what we see from her. She's one of these fighters that has long periods of inactivity, bad fight IQ, and generally just shows a lack of urgency often in her fights. She's the kind of fighter that if you put her up against the cage and kind of control her in the clinch, she doesn't show a lot of urgency to work her way off the cage. On the feet, she just kind of throws single shots and single strikes and isn't that aggressive, doesn't throw combos, doesn't put a lot of volume together. And she's also the type of fighter that whilst she isn't easy to take down, if you do get her down and put her on her back, she's very easy to hold down and control and doesn't make much of an effort to get back up to her feet. And so with Vieira, she's got all the skills required to be the best bantamweight in the world. She came very close to beating Kayla Harrison in her last fight, but it's quite often Ketlen Vieira that gets in her own way. Her lack of inactivity on the feet, her lack of urgency to work through bad positions, giving up cheap takedowns at bad times. Her fight IQ is just very bad. So where GSP said the fighting was 90% mental, from a technical point of view, Vieira is very good, but it's the mental side of the game where she struggles. And if you look at Chiasson, it's a similar sort of story, but presented in a different way, or it personifies itself in a different way. So the mental side of the game is very different, or very much an issue for Chiasson as well, because even though she's not passive and tentative like Vieira is, in actual fact, Chiasson is very aggressive, which is the main reason why I lean towards her in this fight. The issue with Chiasson is that she has been known to quit in the past when put in bad positions. So if you look at her record, in my opinion, she quit against both Raquel Pennington and Irene Aldana. And she's the kind of fighter that I just don't trust to fight through bad positions if she finds herself in a bad position. Like if she gets rocked on the feet, or if she gets put in a deep submission or a bad position on the ground, she's just not the kind of fighter that you can bet to really push through and fight through that and stay alive and continue to give herself a chance of winning. And so they have mental issues in very different ways, these two girls, but with fighting being 90% mental, it makes both of them very difficult to trust. So we can talk a lot about how both these girls match up from a technical point of view, but fundamentally this fight is more than likely going to be decided by which girl's mental game is more on point on Saturday night. And so the reason why I do lean towards Macy Chiasson is because I trust her more than I trust Ketlen Vieira. The reason being, you can kind of split Chiasson's UFC career in two halves. So you can see she came into the UFC in just her third pro fight and started racking up wins against established UFC fighters Larissa Pacheco. Pacheco had been in the UFC previously, was released and then came back on this season of The Ultimate Fighter. So in her first ever fight under the Zuffa banner, in her third pro fight, she was already beating UFC caliber fighters, and we know Larissa Pacheco has had success in PFL. She was a PFL champ. I think she might even have won a PFL tournament. And so if you then look at her record, you've kind of got, a strong start to her career, where there's a lot of hype behind her coming off The Ultimate Fighter, and then she loses to Lena Landsberg, and then over the next few years it's a bit of a mixed bag, and that hype kind of dissipates and fades away as we see her quit in fights against Irene Aldana and Raquel Pennington. But then you see there's a layoff. There's, an 18-month gap between these two fights here, and during this time Chiasson met someone, got married, and in interviews since that break has talked about turning her life around, getting her life back on track, and how she's happier and more motivated than ever to go get the belt. And what we've seen from Chiasson in her last two fights is very different from what we've seen from her in the past, where, in her last two fights, she's very aggressive, she's got that killer instinct, she's mean, she's nasty, she fights at a high pace. She looks to be way more confident and consistent and in a better place mentally than ever before. Now, are these two fights enough for us to feel totally confident that she's turned a corner? Of course not. It's not enough to go on. But it is something to go on, right? These two fights are a sign that Chiasson has kind of put that inconsistent, flaky past behind her, and she's moving on and becoming more aggressive now. Whereas with Ketlen Vieira, she's 33 years old, and even in her last fight against Kayla Harrison, it was her fight IQ that got in the way of her winning. There were long periods of inactivity from her on the feet. She spent way too long getting her back off the cage when Kayla Harrison was kind of just hugging her and wet blanketing her in the clinch up against the cage. And on top of that, when Harrison did get her down, she looked very weak off her back again. So I know Harrison's probably the best bantamweight in the division right now, but all the issues that have plagued Vieira throughout her career were very much still present in that Kayla Harrison fight. All the mental side of the game. So that's why I do lean towards Macy Chiasson this weekend. She's a very tempting bet, but I don't know if it's a smart bet based on the fact that even though she does look a hell of a lot better in her last two fights, ultimately it is just two fights and one of them ended very quickly. Even though her performance against Mayra Bueno Silva was very impressive, and if she performs like that against Vieira, I think she beats Vieira handedly. But both these girls inconsistent, difficult to trust. So at the moment, probably going to be a reluctant pass on Chiasson. Don't really know what to do. She's very tempting. I love betting against fighters like Vieira because when you have a fighter as inconsistent and as passive as Vieira, it's always kind of 50-50 whether they'll show up, and so you can automatically cap their opponent at having a 50% chance of winning. So then if you can just kind of lean towards them a little bit, give them a 60% chance, if they're in the even money odds range, you can often find a nice plus EV bet, a nice position to get your money into. But at the same time, even though this Irene Aldana fight was a very long time ago, it's the end of the fight is still a big red flag with how, I'll show it to you so you can see for yourself the issue. So if we just bring it up, because if you're not familiar with the fight, you're probably thinking, well, what's the big deal, Chris? Well, I'll show you. So if we go into this third round, it's just a very strange finish. So late on in the fight, Chiasson has kind of got top position on Aldana. Hits this nice takedown. Now watch this, it's actually insane. There's only 3 minutes left to go in the fight. 3 minutes left to go in round 3. This is one of the strangest finishes of a UFC fight I think I've ever seen. So if we just skip through, watch this. So Aldana postures up, kicks her in the rib with only 2 minutes 40 left to go, and she kind of just rolls over and dies. Which is always going to be a red flag. Does that ever leave you mentally? I'm not so sure. Probably not. So, yeah. Reluctant pass on Chiasson, but with how bad Vieira is on the ground, I do like Chiasson to get this done this weekend. So in terms of the over-under, very likely this one goes to a decision. Vieira's last 7 have gone to a decision, so very likely this one goes to a decision as well. She's skilled enough to defend herself on the ground. Not dangerous enough to really finish Chiasson on the feet, although with the finish we've just seen in the Irene Aldana fight, who the fuck knows. Chiasson, very difficult fighter to trust to push through a bad position or getting hurt, or to push through getting hurt if Vieira were to land a big shot. But you can see from Vieira's record, she's not that dangerous. So the odds reflect that. You can't really bet that. It is steep favourite odds. And in terms of the props on this one, we don't really have too many props at the moment. The only one I would consider would be Chiasson by decision. But the odds are absolutely terrible. So you got to give that a miss. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, please hit the like button below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great weekend. Hope you make loads of money Saturday. Check out my live betting group. And I'll see you all in the next one very soon. Nice one, guys. Bye.